everyone, Karen the Warp Spinster here. Thanks for joining me today for the final clue in the mystery quilt. Here I ended up squaring my blocks up to 18¼ inches because I discovered that some of my blocks were just shy of 18½, and rather than try to fudge as I was doing the seams and trying to remember which ones were a little shy and which weren't, I decided that I would just square them all up to 18¼ inches, and then they would go together perfectly. That meant that I needed to cut an equal amount off of all four sides in order for things to match up well when I went to sew the blocks together. So let me show you how I went about doing that squaring up. To start with, I want to talk just a minute about squaring up the blocks. This is a large block, 18½ inches to square up, which probably will run into some issues for many of you, as it did for me. I do not have an 18½ inch square up ruler. I have a 16½, but I don't have an 18½. And this mat that I'm using here is certainly not going to be enough. It's like a 12 by 18. I have an 18 by 24, but that's still not wide enough to do 8½ to use the measurements on the mat. So I am going to show you a couple of ways that you can do that. If you have a large enough mat that has the markings there, this is the one time where you might use the markings on the mat to square it up. Most of the time I recommend that you not do that, that you use your ruler, but if you have a mat that size, that is an option. And I'll give you two more options. This one is with a 12½ inch ruler. This isn't a completed block yet, it's almost there, but it gives you the same idea. So this is a 12½ inch square up ruler. And I know how much, in the end, it needs to be 18½ inches, so I can measure it across and see if it's 18½. And then to square it up, I want the edges to be square, have it be cut straight, so when I put them together, they're going to go together nicely. But I also want this to be square. So I want to be able to trim these two corners at the same time because I know that the ruler is going to give me a perfect 90-degree angle there. So I'm going to take my square up ruler and I can tell what these measurements should be. So this is 3 2-inch squares, so that's going to be 6 inches, but then I still have a seam allowance I need to allow for here, which is another 1/4. So I can look on my ruler and line it up with the side here, but then I want to line up my 6 1/4 inch line, which is right along here, and I've got it lined up on that seam all the way down so that I know it's straight with this block. Then I have other checks along the way because this next one should be 2 inches from that. So it's going to be an 8 1/4, and my seam is a little bit not straight there, but that's a pressing issue more than a sewing issue. Here's 10 1/4 here. So I've got things lined up nicely. So this side I can trim. Now, I'm a little bit shy on this side, but it's not enough to concern me. If it is smaller, say it's an 1/8 of an inch, pretty consistently smaller, then probably most of your blocks are going to be that way because that's the seam allowance that you used. So you can then take off a bit, but do it on both sides of the block because you want these all to match up. And if you lop everything off this side and then on another block you take it off the other side, then these will not match up. So just split the difference. But I think I'm going to be okay. And now I can measure from here to here. And here again is my 8 1/4. So this is 1 2 3 4 times 2, because they're 2-inch squares, add my 1/4 inch seam allowance that I still have up here. And there is my 8 1/4 inch line here. Everything lines up well, so I know it's square. Can cut here, and then I can, if I stand up, then cut that so I know that that's square. Now it's only going to take me 12 inches, but then I can turn it 90 degrees and do the same thing. Find my points that I know are, say, should be 6 1/4, 8 1/4, 10 1/4, whatever, and then square up on this side. Now the other way you can do it, if you don't have a square up ruler, is to take this is a 6-inch ruler, not 6 1/2. So that's not going to help me any because I need that 1/4 inch there. So then I can take a second ruler, just like we did with cutting, and I can line up here, and here's 2 1/4, which should match up with this line here. And then I can actually slide this down so that I can cut that corner and get it perfectly square. So it's just adding the 2 rulers together. So 6 here and 2 1/2 from this ruler, and then I can trim it that way. So those are 3 ways you can tackle squaring up the block. I have a full block here now, and I'm going to trim it up. I have discovered that some of my blocks are about 1/8 of an inch shy, and while I could probably fake that, this one's actually not too bad, it wouldn't go together as perfectly as I would like. So I'm going to cut 1/8 of an inch off all 4 sides. Or actually, I'll be trimming this up to 18 1/4 instead of 18 1/2, because it will be 1/8 of an inch shy of 18 1/4 all the way around. So it'll be 1/8 of an inch here, 1/8 of an inch there, which is 1/4. So instead of lining this up on 8 1/4, I'm going to line it up at 8 1/8. But I need to do all 4 sides, so this one actually does pretty well at 8 1/4, but I'm going to drop it down to 8 1/8 as well, so that I'm even all the way around. All right, and that's as far as I can go with my 12 1/2 inch ruler. So I was able to get that corner correct. Now I'm going to turn it 90 degrees to the opposite corner, and I'll do the same thing. So 8 1/8 here, and 8 1/8 here. Get that lined up. And again, I'll get my perfect corner there. Pardon my elbow. And now I'll turn it 90 degrees. I like to get the opposite angles first for some reason I don't necessarily understand. And then I'm going to do 8 1/8 on the remaining 2 corners. And which corner do I have left? Must be this one. And it's going to take me a little while to square this up, but that's all right because it will save me time and grief in the long run when my blocks go together really nicely and perfectly fit. That one was off by a bit. Could have cut that more cleanly if I weren't having to avoid the camera. And there I have a block that is squared up to 18 1/4 instead of 18 1/2. But as long as I square up all of them to that same measurement and make sure that I take an equal amount off of all 4 sides, then they will still fit together, and each of these pieces will fit together as well. And here is a finished quilt top. As you can see, there are sort of diagonal lines going through it and vertical and horizontal, and I think that gives the quilt some nice movement, and the scraps give it a little more energy so that it's quite a lively quilt, I think. Let's take a look at how you're going to put it together. I have some blocks on paper here, and it's really very simple. You take one block with, and this will be the upper left corner, that has the bulk on the lower left. And then you take the next block and just rotate it 90 degrees so that the bulk is on the upper left. And all you're going to do laying this out is just alternate those 2 directions. So the next block then would have the bulk on the lower left, and you would continue across whether you're doing the 4x5 or the 5x6. So the smaller size, which is the one that I made that I showed you, is 4 blocks across by 5 blocks down. The larger quilt is going to be 5 blocks across and 6 down. And you will just across the row continue to alternate the direction that you turn those blocks. Comes another roll of thunder. The rain is welcome, but the darkness and the thunder I could do without right now. Now in the next row, we're going to do just the same thing. This block has the bulk on the lower left, so the one below it needs to be on the upper right. And the next one, I'm just going to continue to flip it. So this one has the bulk on the lower left, and then this block would be on the upper right. So all you're doing is alternating back and forth. Now I have done diagrams for you, and you will find the links to those PDFs in the description below. There's one for the 20 blocks, and then there's also one for the 30 block version. One thing that I found, I was working with a smaller diagram when I was putting it together and just checking myself on how these were to be laid out. And particularly in this size, it became a little confusing. Where's the block? Where is the turn? And so I found I actually folded mine, but you could also, move that out of here because you weren't going to have that one anyway. You could also take some sticky notes and just block off, okay, here's the first block. I know it goes that direction. And then you could move across and find the next block, block that off and figure out the direction. But I don't think you'll need to use that. Depends on how your brain works. But I think just doing the start out on the lower left, flip to the upper right, etc., or turn to the upper right, I think that will work pretty well for you, and I don't think it will be very confusing. The next thing I want to talk about is how I organize my blocks once I've laid them out. It's a pretty good size quilt. We've got 18-inch blocks and quite a few blocks, so it takes up a lot of room. I have a design wall downstairs in my studio, but it isn't large enough for this size quilt. So I ended up laying mine out on the floor, and it was kind of crossing up into the coffee table and all over. And I didn't want to live with that being like that until I had the blocks sewn together. Now I actually did them all in one day, but if you don't have the opportunity to do that, and particularly if you have pets who like to help you out with your quilting, if it's on the floor, here's what I do to organize my blocks and to take them to the sewing machine. Or, you know, maybe if I've laid them out at home and I'm going to a retreat or a class and I want to be able to move those without losing track of how I have them turned. For most quilts that use blocks, it matters, well, for many, I shall say, it matters the order that you have them in and how they are turned. So let's pretend this is our quilt and these are the blocks. I've laid them out this way, and I want to be sure that when I go to the sewing machine, they're going to stay that way. So the first thing I'm going to do is to take the one on the far right, pick that up, and I'm just going to stack them, keeping that top one on top. And then I'm going to take a pin and pin through all those layers in the upper left corner. I always use the upper left corner because then I know that this is the top left of that section. If I somehow drop it or things get turned around and it ends up like this, I know that I have to turn it back this way before I sew again. Then I pick up the next row in the same way, put a pin in it, in the upper left, and put it there. Now, one thing that I can do, and that I will do particularly if I am moving it to take to a retreat or a class, is to also take just a little scrap of paper and indicate the number of the row. So this is row 3, this is row 2, and then that will go under the pin. Depends on how far I have to transport it and how sharp my brain feels that day. And then I do that for all the rows. Another scrap here, and that will be row 1. And if I'm doing, probably isn't necessary because you always know what the upper left is, but if I were doing a, let me think, 6, and I didn't want that to be mistaken for a 9, then of course I just put the lines under it there. So now I can stack these, and it doesn't matter. I can do 1, 2, 3 like this, however I want to do it, because I know exactly the order they go in and their orientation. Then when I take it to the machine, I'll just take the first 2 columns. These are going to be the columns. And I will take the pin out of here, and this will probably sit on my lap or on one table to the side. And then this, I will remove the pin, but I will put it back in the top one in the upper left corner. I may even, in fact, use a safety pin. I always keep a safety pin handy for the upper left corner because that stays there until my quilt top is finished. That way, if things get turned around, then I always know that I'm adding onto this side of the quilt top as I am sewing. So then when I have these 2 laid out in front of me in the correct orientation on near my sewing machine, then I'm just going to take the first 2, run those through my sewing machine, don't clip the thread, pick up the next 2, run those through the sewing machine, don't clip the thread, etc. So let me show you what that looks like. I've run these through the machine, and they're all still attached to each other because I didn't clip the threads in between. So I know these are in proper order. And then when I open these out, I have the first 2 columns sewn together and ready for the next column. I tend to press as I go, but it depends on how you like your workflow to go. You want to press these seams in opposite directions. So this seam, I'm going to press that direction. Doesn't matter which, as long as you alternate on your way down, so that when this is sewed together, those seams are going to match up. Now, of course, if you press your seams open, that's moot. Then this one will go to the right, this one will go to the left. So I have these all put together. Now I'm going to take my next row, in my case 3. I can take the number and the pin out. And now I'm going to take this to the machine. This is going to be to the side. And now I'm just going to stitch this on, run it through the machine. Don't clip the thread. This one's right up next waiting for me. So the next piece will go on there, run that through the machine, that through the machine, and that through the machine. So I will show you what that looks like. And just as I did before, I'm going to press the seam of this the same direction as the other ones in this row. So this one was pressed to the right. This one will also be pressed to the right. I would actually use the iron, but for simplicity and time's sake here, that one will go to the left. This one will go to the right. And this one will go to the left. And you just continue that process for however many columns you have. In our case, it will be either 4 by 5 or 5 by 6. Now, I will say that when you're working with an 18-inch block, it does get unwieldy, particularly in this first row, because the things can kind of get twisted around. But just take your time, be patient with it, and then it will get easier as you move further out in the rows. Now, of course, if that doesn't make sense to you, if that's not how you want to work, then you can absolutely put the rows together in whatever way is easiest for you. If you are able to leave it out for a while and you want to pick up one, sew 2 together, bring them back, find the next block, absolutely you can do that. This is just one method that I use particularly if you aren't going to have time to devote to putting the whole quilt top together and you have a cat or a dog wandering around who likes to help you hold down your quilt while you're making it. Then, of course, all you need to do once you've got those pressed is to flip these over, match up those seams. I usually will pin just to make sure that I get those corners correct and sew across, and then continue to do that. And then you can press those seams whichever direction you want, or press them open. So that's how I organize things. Next up, I want to talk just a little bit about quilting. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because quilting is really kind of a personal thing, but maybe we can talk about some options to consider when you're quilting. I'm going to switch to my iPad. Because of the gloomy weather here, I would probably have to turn on a light. Let me show you first before I switch to the iPad. I take it back. I like to audition quilting ideas. Sometimes if I do it just in my head, then it doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't really work out when I do the quilting. So I like to have some sort of visual audition process. You can easily do it with one of the diagrams that I've given you and a sheet of tracing paper. And let me show you how that would work. I want to talk just a little bit about quilting, not in great detail because I haven't decided myself how to quilt this. And quilting's kind of a really personal thing, but let's talk about some options. This is one of the reasons that I've given you these diagrams, not so much for the layout because that's pretty simple, just a rotation, alternating rotation. But this can help you when you are trying to visualize quilting. If you want to do an edge-to-edge design, absolutely, that's doable. If you want to do a more customized design, then you can audition things. You could actually even do this with an edge-to-edge and just kind of do a general look for what that edge-to-edge design will be. Pardon me while I wander off, just looking for a marker. I just have a piece of tracing paper here. Any old tracing paper will do if you've got a transparency, and you can use then the dry erase markers or transparency markers that you can wipe off and redo them. But I'm just going to do tracing paper here, and I've got a pen so you can see it. This is purposely done in pretty bright, dark sort of colors so that you can see through tracing paper. Now, you could do an edge to edge. You could just do straight lines going either direction, both directions. You could do diagonal lines. This has kind of a nice diagonal look to it, so you could do some diagonal lines. And of course, you could also mix it. So you could do some diagonal lines and then some straight lines. Let's do, you can just sketch these out, of course, but let's just play with a ruler just to get a general idea. The spacing might be quite different, but you could audition that. I tend to just audition a general look before I worry too much about the spacing, and then go back and figure out what kind of spacing I want. I'm not actually making these even very parallel necessarily. So then for these diagonal pieces, if I want to really emphasize that diagonal, then I could do this. And then in between, do something completely different. So I could do straight lines like that, or the other direction, horizontally or vertically, which would give me a very linear look. Or I could do something curvy in there. I tend to, at least when I'm doing edge to edge, if I have a very linear design on the top, I tend to like to do something wavy or flowy on the quilting design, just to sort of counteract or complement those straight lines. But some people prefer to have straight lines throughout. And if yours are modern look kind of fabrics, then there are lots of edge to edge designs that are designed for that have straight lines. So if I were doing this, then I might do, I don't know, I'll just do some wavy thing here. This is not what I would use. So that's an option in between. Let's try doing straight lines in between here just to see which I like. And this could be just a plain version to try out various things on just one sheet of paper. And I could vary the width here, so I could do more like matchstick quilting, which is very close together. Or change the width of those. It's kind of interesting. Then, if I wanted to do a modern type of look, one of the things that I like about a lot of modern quilts that I see is they basically isolate a part of the design, like a piece of the design, and then do quilting in just that particular area. So it isn't just a block, it may be a motif or something within that block. So here, for example, maybe I would focus on this bulky section here. And maybe I just want to do diagonal lines that fan out from a point. And if I'm doing this, I probably would not take them all down to a single point because that's so much thread down there. But I could do diagonal lines going this way. I know you can't see this very well yet. I will move my hand out of the way. And I didn't do that very starbursty, but I really like that. I could do some kind of stitch in the ditch around here just to define that, or not. And then I would think about what I'm doing in these. So if I want to emphasize really this bulk area, then I would do the fan there, and let's see. Then rather than separating this section, this is a block here, rather than treating this as a section, I could just use everything. Well, let's do that down here. Let me just do a quick drawing here. Or I could do it the opposite direction and have this fan out the other way. Ooh, I kind of like that. All right, now I have to try that. I'll speed through this so you don't have to watch me draw it. So I have these two different looks. I thought I was going to like this one better. I'm not sure that I do. I'd have to think about how these are going to come together. And if I want them to merge. Or if I want to have the outline there. But in any case, let's do a quick one down here. We'll just pretend we're going to have them going all the same direction so you can see how these play out. My other pen gave out, or doesn't like the tracing paper, so this one gets really juicy on tracing paper. All right, I have those blocks, and let me outline them here just so you can see where they are. I would not necessarily do that. All right, then here I might just do straight lines. And these might be matchstick quilting. I'd like to do about the same density of quilting. Not exactly the same, but not so far different that some of it's going to be poofy and some of it is going to be really dense. It tends to distort the quilt. So these straight lines, which would probably be matchstick quilting in my case. It takes forever to do matchstick, but I really like the look. And they may or may not be equally spaced lines. Then that sort of throws that into the background and emphasizes these more. So that's a look I might do. If I wanted to still emphasize this up and down look here, then I might space it a little farther apart when I'm doing that. Now oops, should have taped this down. The horizontal lines then are going to sort of get lost in the crowd. You'll still see them, of course, because there's high contrast there. But another option I could have had would have been to quilt these first. And then just taken these lines to that point. So I do it here, travel over, down, travel over, up, etc. So let's see how that might work here. It's a nice thing about using this tracing paper on top of a diagram. It allows you to try out a lot of things on one sheet. Sorry, I'm having to use a ballpoint here. And it loops up. And then I could take my vertical quilting this way. and just leave that less quilted, shall we say, and in a horizontal direction. So this emphasizes the scrappy pieces of it and sends the rest of it to the background, the negative space to the background. And that breaks it up a little more. So it really depends on how vertical you might want it to look. If you want to break it up with some horizontal, what do you want to emphasize? Now you could also do completely different motifs in those areas. So if you want to do something more traditional here, you might do the is it pumpkin seed? I always have trouble doing these. Can you tell? All right, these are just basically reversed, right? Well, you would do a better job of that. Anyway, you could do a more traditional, that's really bad. You can do a more traditional kind of design there. You could do a zigzag sort of thing for a different look. Just try out different designs and see what you like. I'm really liking this sunburst sort of look. I'm not sure about these vertical lines along there. But I'm going to play with it some more. I often do this on my iPad, which I do it in Procreate, just import a photo of it, and then I can try all kinds of designs and combinations and do different layers. So if you have that ability, then you might want to do it that way rather than tracing paper. But just get yourself a pad of tracing paper, and it's relatively inexpensive. Once you have tried out different options and decided, okay, I really like that, then you could start a new sheet and just play around with this as the basis and different things for backgrounds. So just play with some ideas for how you might want to quilt it. And I was not at all sure what I wanted to do, but I'm really liking at least this much of the idea. And this is kind of interesting. I would take another sheet then and work out how I would do this intersection here when those two come together. So that's our mystery quilt. I thank you for joining me. I've had a lot of fun doing this, and I hope you have too. You'll notice that I have named this pole dance. It's up to you if you want to name it something different. I've never seen a pole dance or done one in my life, but I noticed when I was putting these together that this vertical line and I don't know, it just looked like that to me. Thank you for joining me. On Wednesday, I'll be revisiting some scrap stash busting that I started last week, so I hope to see you then. In the meantime, be well, be happy, be quilting. Peace out.